Hello, everyone, and welcome to our virtual celebration for the book Inviting Interruptions, Wonder Tales in the 21st Century. My name is Marie Sweetman. I'm the acquisitions editor at Wayne State University Press for our series in fairy tale studies, founded by series editor Donald Haza, which this wonderful book is a part of. So this event will be recorded, and please mute yourself for the presentation portion. But feel free to add questions at any time to the chat box at the bottom of your screen. We should have about 10 to 15 minutes for a Q&A at the end. And during that time, in addition to the chat box, feel free to raise your hand or use the raise hand feature, which I think is in reactions at the bottom of your screen. So you can ask your question out loud. So we'll get started. I'm going to introduce the editors of the volume, and I'm here with them and several of the contributors who the editors will then introduce momentarily. We have Christina Baccalega, Professor Emerita of English at the University of Hawaii, Manoa, where she taught fairy tales and their adaptations, folklore and literature, and cultural studies. The author of Fairy Tales Transformed, 21st Century Adaptations and the Politics of Wonder, and Legendary Hawaii and the Politics of Place, Tradition, Translation, and Tourism. She also co-edits Marvels and Tales, Journal of Fairy Tale Studies with Annie Duggan. And since 1983, Christina has lived and worked in Hawaii, where she continues to grapple with her responsibilities as a woman and scholar of color in an occupied nation. Today, she joins us from Brooklyn, where she is enjoying time with family, especially Talia, her baby granddaughter. And we have Jennifer Orme. She's an independent scholar, editor, and writer. She lives in Toronto and teaches online for the Women's and Gender Studies Department at the University of Winnipeg. Jennifer has published on fairy tales in Marvels and Tales, Fairy Tale Studies, and in a number of books. She's also written feature magazine articles, long-form, multi-sensory ghost stories, and adventure tales, and creative nonfiction on topics ranging from 17th century countesses to modernist dance and contemporary haunted dolls, which I definitely would like to learn more about later. This was a really exciting volume to bring to the press. I remember just being blown away by the fabulous group of contributors and the range of text. There's prose and visual art and comics and even video stills, and you're going to see a lot of that today. And being really intrigued with the editor's framing with these subversive interruptions and seductive invitations into the world of Wonder Tales. And finally, their very committed approach, intersectional approach to this work as well. So Christina and Jennifer, thank you so much for your incredible work on this volume. We're so excited to celebrate it. And with that, I turn it over to you. I think Jennifer is going to get us started.
Okay, well, thanks, Marie. That's really lovely introduction. And so Marie's told you, Inviting Interruptions is our collection or anthology of short stories, visual images, and visual verbal texts that relate to fairy tales and wonder in a myriad different ways. But to start off, I wanted to talk a little bit about our title because we think it's really quite clever. It's playful and it has multiple meanings that can even be kind of like contradictory. Because when we think about it, an invitation is a request for attention, right? It's seductive, it's polite, and it's asking you to come along. On the other hand, interruptions, we look at really quite differently. They're rude, right? They stop the flow, and they seem to contradict invitations. But when we put them together in conjunction, an invitation to interrupt can become an asking for something to stop that smooth flow of the expected. And then that interruption itself becomes an invitation to shift perspective, to see the world, the tale, the genre from a different space and different places. So as editors, those are the kinds of things we were thinking about and looking at when we were choosing the texts and visual images to include in the book. And with the book, I think what we're doing is we're inviting you to sort of look for and even revel in the kinds of interruptions that the works in the book enact. So that's a little bit about our title, and you might want to know a little bit about sort of where the ideas sort of came from. And it was really, in some ways, Christina's brainchild that she brought me in on, and I was so lucky to do that. But Christina, do you want to take over and talk a little bit about where the ideas originated from?
You're muted, Christina.
So as Christina gets her mute on or off, there we go. There you
go. Excuse me. Okay, yes. So what prompted us? You know, I still remember the thrill of reading Angela Carter for the first time, and the thrill of reading Jack Zipes's anthology, Don't Bet on the Prince. It's such a vivid memory. And we're talking about the late 70s, we're talking about the 80s. Such a long time ago, but you know, I am a crone. So, you know, like many of you, I believe that fairy tales are transformative, that they continue to transform themselves. And so I really wanted to, some 40 years later, to showcase how fairy tales and wonder tales are transformative today, how they have transformed. And I knew that Jennifer was like my partner in this. I wanted her on this project with me.
And we had a lot of fun with it. And I think for us, one of those ways to look at that transformative aspect of fairy tales and the kinds of transformations that they have done and that they continue to go through is really looking through an intersectional lens, which was important for us. So we used that when we were choosing the text that we were going to include in the book, both visual and verbal. And each of the works, I think, in Inviting Interruptions touches upon multiple aspects of our identities and our worldviews. So while we think that these stories and images are for everyone, we also recognize that everyone isn't like everyone else, right? We all come from different starting points, and we all have multiple different identities and pressures on our lives and places in the world. And we take them with us into the worlds of wonders as well. So we hope that bringing these all together in Inviting Interruptions, we are also hoping that the stories, the images talk to each other sort of intertextually in surprising and revealing ways as well.
Yes, you know, I wanted so much for this project. And when I read Marina Warner's very generous blurb for Inviting Interruptions, I thought, wow, that's exactly what I'd hoped this collection would be. And she calls it a passionate manifesto for 21st century wonder tales that aren't scared off by polemical themes and take us down bold and unexpected paths. And going down these paths with Jennifer and all the contributors was just such a joy.
It really was. And I think for me, one of those unexpected paths, well, it wasn't so much unexpected, it was a planned for path, because from as long as I can remember, I always knew that my first book, and I knew there would be a first book. I didn't know what it'd be about, but I knew there'd be a first book one day, and it was going to have pictures. It was going to have visual images. So when Christina and I were talking about it, and we were both completely on board on the same way, thinking about how we had to have visual images in the text as well, we were super happy that the press didn't think it was a mad idea and encouraged us, and have done such an amazing job at making these gorgeous texts show up throughout the book. And I think it's important to recognize too that one of the things that might be slightly unexpected about the artwork in Inviting Interruptions is that each image is a standalone text into itself, rather than, say, illustrating a specific story, for example. Illustration has been really important to the literary fairy tale tradition for a long time, but we wanted to really sort of expand or throw our net a little wider for this and take in what's sometimes called, the fine arts. So we have included multiple forms. We have photography. And Christina, do you want to hit the button?
Yes. I do.
So we have photography and sculpture, figurines and paintings. We have mixed media, as well as I've said before, visual verbal texts like comics. And we've even experimented by somehow including a film into a book with the link to David Kaplan's short film, The Little Red Riding Hood. We've also got a really wide range of creators, some of whom are here today and some of whom weren't able to make it, but they are also a wide range, as I say, coming from entirely new and emerging artists, such as Anne here and Rosalind Hyatt Orme, who did the figurine on our cover, as well as really well-established and award-winning artists and writers like Sean Tan, Sherry Boyle, Emma Donahue, and many others. I don't want to just pick out some people, but I'm picking out some people who weren't able to join us today. Ultimately, I think we chose these images and stories that we thought were worth conversing about. And we have included our own notes to sort of start those conversations off in people's minds, at least. They start off with sort of our musings and our questions and our thoughts about wonder.
And wonder is the other path that we really wanted to explore when we chose to feature Wonder Tales in the title of the collection. We were purposefully kind of reacting to or against the kind of enchanting magic of mainstream fairy tales. Wonder is a heuristic for us, a heuristic for being in the world, a mix of curiosity, engagement, awe, connection, humility, possibilities. It's a way to mobilize emotions and enact relationships that reconnect to non-capitalist, non-human-centered ways of being in the world. So Wonder Tales are transformative for us as they interrupt things as they are, and they invite us to see the genre, us, the world, differently, alternatively. That was the big idea, I guess, behind this book. To put together a book, of course, there's a lot of work and a lot of people at work. So we just want to very briefly, because I know we're running out of time, thank the press, the editors, the board at Wayne State University Press. They were immediately supportive of the project. And a special shout out to Marie Sweetman, our acquisition editors, but really thank you to everyone. I'm personally indebted to Aiko Yamashiro and Brian Kamauli Kuwada, who also is a contributor to the collection, for putting together a special issue entitled Rooted in Wonder, Tales of Indigenous Activism and Community Organizing. And I also want to acknowledge my students at the university, graduate and undergraduates, over the years, whose questions, imaginations, needs, and desires for stories have really nurtured my understanding of Wonder Tales and why they matter. Jennifer, we have many more people to thank.
We do. So I will ditto Christina's thanks very heartfeltfully. Yep, that's how I'm doing it. But also we will love to thank our contributors, especially those who are here today, but all of our contributors, even those who aren't able to attend, but all of whom have been really quite wonderful to work with and whose work quite literally inspired us as editors. We've been immensely fortunate in our contributors who have been generous and enthusiastic about contributing to the project of Inviting Interruptions. So we hope that they are as proud of the book as we are and what we've been able to put together for everyone, hopefully, to be able to take a look at and a quick read of and enjoy. So I think that's probably enough from Christina and me for now, and we should probably turn to some of our contributors. Do you want to take it away, Christina?
Absolutely, this is great. Our first presenter is artist Su Blackwell. She lives and works on the south coast of England with her husband and daughter. And her contribution to Inviting Interruptions is titled Once Upon a Time. And Sue, I know you want to share your screen. Go ahead.
Okay.
All yours.
Okay, so firstly, I'm thrilled to be included in the book. Thank you. And so thinking about what fairy tales means to me, well, fairy tales are deep within my psyche, recognizable but strange, one-dimensional like a dream. The process of my work is paper cutouts glued onto wires, which lends itself to that notion of one-dimensionality that exists in fairy tales. My figures are cut out outlines, so suggesting that they could be anybody. And I often start by cutting out the figures, and this in turn shapes the two-dimensional landscapes. I pick out words from the text of the books, and this adds another layer of meaning. My characters, whether they be animal or human form, are often on their way somewhere, about to discover something, or they might be caught up in a never-ending task, such as sweeping words on an invisible breeze. I'm interested in classical fairy tales and how they can be questioned and reimagined. And as a child, my favourites were Rumpelstiltskin and the Shoemaker and the Elves. I was less keen on fairy tales about princes and princesses. When I began making art, a sense of wonderment and storytelling was always evident in my work, although perhaps I wasn't conscious of it at the time. I made birds' masks welded out of safety pins, and a child's cotton dress with moths cut out of the skirt of the fabric and suspended on strings. So these are fantastical objects made from everyday materials, and that's how I think about fairy tales. They're fantastical tales made from everyday life. When I began to work with books in 2003, I was drawn to the fairy tales of my childhood by the Brothers Grimm, Hans Christian Andersen, and Madame de Launay. I'm drawn to fairy tales for their ambiguity. You can shape them to your own interpretation, adding new notions to already recognizable themes. For example, in my work Red Riding Hood from 2010, Red Riding Hood is picking not flowers, but a line of text out of the book, suggesting that language and books are a form of power, which could potentially save her from the wolf. So this brings me to my work Once Upon a Time from 2016, which is featured in Wonder Tales and is based on a generic fairy tale by the Brothers Grimm. It's not based on one particular fairy tale. And the lights I use in my work allude to a sense of hope, which I believe is present in many fairy tales. And with each generation, I feel these tales grow and change, but the roots of the stories remain the same, much like ourselves. And I find they are rich pickings for inspiration. That's the end of my talk.
Oh, great, thank you, Sue. Sorry about that, I was a little slow on the uptake, but thank you very much for sharing those gorgeous images and for having that in our book. We're so excited. Our next presenter is film writer and director David Kaplan. He is based in New York. He's in LA right now where it's nice and sunny. And we were delighted to include his short film, Little Red Riding Hood, in Inviting Interruptions. Go ahead, David.
Hi, hi everybody. Forgive me, I haven't really prepared remarks, so I'm just winging it. So if I go off on a tangent, you'll understand why. I made this film, I guess it's over 20 years ago now, 97. So it's an early one, it's an old one for me, but it's one that's still very close to my heart. The I've done other fairy tale based films, and now I'm writing mostly horror films, which I would say also largely have a basis in folklore, fairy tales, myths as well. So I think fairy tales, they're just a very rich base for many artists and writers and poets and basically almost any media you can think of, because they're very minimalist and open in a way. It's not like reading Harry Potter, where it's like an exchange of consciousnesses with the author, or the Game of Thrones books, or a modern novel where it's things get very specific, where the descriptions of characters and places and clothes and smells. Fairy tales are very spare. The character descriptions are basically non-existent. You just know if somebody's a girl or a boy or a father or mother, a witch or a king. The locations are also equally spared. So there's a lot of breathing room for a reader I think the title of your book is very apt. I think it's an invitation to help in the creative process while you're reading, and to create something in your mind's eye that's very unique to each reader, so that when artists, I think, get a hold of this, there's a lot of there's just a lot of room to explore, and to create adaptations that are very unique and individual, and that are based on these very rich and powerful stories that are, to me, there's really no difference between fairy tales and myths and stories in the Bible. It's all these sort of oral tales that have been passed through generations, and they're like pieces of glass in the ocean. They become smooth and perfect and deeply meaningful. Anyway, that's how I felt when I read them as a kid. And then when I would see the occasional film adaptation, I would say, well, that's interesting, but that's not really how I pictured Red Riding Hood. That's not really how I pictured Rumpelstiltskin. So it just felt like there was a lot of opportunity to sort of take these things and run with them. In this particular version of Little Red Riding Hood, which I actually came across, I think it was also in a book by Jack Zipes. I forget the title, but I think it was a book largely devoted to analysis of Red Riding Hood. I just thought it was such a peculiar and wonderful version. It's from the Brittany region of France. It felt very mischievous, and it just felt like it was taking a different tack on the whole thing. And what I also like about these stories, which I think was mentioned in the book, is audiences come to them with these expectations. Like they've known them forever. They knew them as kids. They remember them. They know how it's going to go. So there's an opportunity, especially in narrative filmmaking, to sort of set sail with these expectations and this comfort level where people think they're on solid ground, and then you can slowly subvert the expectations and get into territory where the audience didn't realize that they were going. And I think that's a lot of fun narratively. What else? I don't know. I'm sort of running out of steam. But is that 5 minutes? Yeah, okay.
That's perfect.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, David. So our next presenter is Dan Taulapapa McMullen, excuse me. Artist and poet from Samoa America. His art studio and writing practice are based in Hudson, New York, where he lives with his partner. And Taulapapa contributed I2 to our collection, which I am now going to show. Dan, you can unmute yourself, please.
This is it's part of an installation called Away, Away. And It's actually here in my studio. It's right over there on a mannequin. I created it with this piece, which is artificial flowers on a bodysuit. And they're in an installation in 2016. And the overall installation was about tiki kitsch. And it was as Polynesian, looking at stereotypes or appropriation of Polynesian imagery in popular culture. And so I was working with this idea of the lei, or in Samoa we call the se, and to decorate oneself in the other at moments of greeting is called seana, which is to adorn oneself with flowers. So I did it with artificial flowers. And I started sewing, talk about fairy tales. There I was in my studio sewing these artificial flowers onto bodysuits. And I thought, oh my God, this is going to take forever. And then I realized you could use little safety pins. Safety pin them on. And then about a year later in 2017, my friend Rosanna was doing residency at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And she said, let's do a performance piece together. And I said, well, I have these bodysuit pieces that were on mannequins. We can wear them. And she wore this one in this photograph with the leaves. And I wore that one, which I have back up on mannequins because I'm going to do another performance piece with them in Hawaii next year with two Kanaka Maoli performers. So I wrote, so I got to thinking about, for this event today, I got to thinking about the word aitu. And sometimes, like when Christina said she wanted to use this image, she said, what's the title? And I thought, oh, aitu, just off the top of my head. And then sometimes you show artwork somewhere else and someone says, well, what's the title? And then you come up with another title and then you realize looking back, oh, they had different titles. So it's kind of spontaneous, but the word aitu means ghost. And so I thought I would write a poem about this word. I'm from Samoa Malika, which is American Samoa. It's also called Samoa Isasae. And Sasae means the rising sun. Samoa was divided into an American colony, which was colonized 100 years ago, when Cuba and Puerto Rico and the Philippines were colonized in the Spanish-American War, which also brought my grandfather to Samoa, which is how I have this last name, McMullen. And Western Samoa was called Samoa Isisifo, which means where the sun sets in Samoa. And when Samoans die, their spirit, or their aitu, retraces the archipelago of Samoa, the Sua'iwi, which is the backbone of Samoa that goes from island to island. And they go from the east to the west. They go to a certain place called the Sama, which is where the sun rises in Samoa, and they go to where the sun sets. And that's the journey to the afterlife. So I wrote this poem called Aitu. Aitu are holes in the universe. We appear out of Aitu. We disappear into Aitu. Now they're ghosts of ghosts. Someone told us to bite and swallow, and we did. They were a fish, a butterfly, a stone, a small tree. They were a place in the rainforest, in the house, the battlefield. We are connected by machines now, artificial intelligence. But our flesh is so weak. It dies like a flower, like friendship. Our friendship with these ghosts is tied to our flesh, but we have no flesh here. Aitu of Aitu, ghosts of ghosts, how do we mourn them as photographs, files, numbers? Apelli was a Tonatu Aitu, half human, half spirit. His nodding staff first rising over the ridge from his hillside garden, ankle-length Zulu, shirtless, a pumpkin under his arm, and Aitu. While Seuli scolded her dancers around the corner, the past, Apelli said, is the future. The archive tells us nothing of the present, I said, almost nothing. Oh, sorry. The archive tells us of the present, I said, almost nothing of the past. The past is not the past anymore. It never was, said Apelli. This rope of love, of Alofa, this alley between you and your Aitu, this rope plunging deep into the sea pulls you to your Aitu. Trembling on the wall of this machine, ghostless, soulless, let me be my Aitu, my whole, into the whole past and future, with dirt, blood, air, fire, love, and darkness. That was my thoughts on Aitu, or the coast.
That's
And
gorgeous.
thank you, Christina and Jennifer, for kindly including my photograph in the book and to give this amazing talk with people.
Well, we were so pleased and so honored. And thank you for that, what I believe is sort of an exclusive poem to this book launch. So thank you, Dan. Next, we're going to keep moving right along. Our next presenter is fiction writer and scholar, Veronica Shanos. She lives in New York City. She teaches at Queens College, CUNY, and her short story in Inviting Interruptions also just came out in her new book, Burning Girls. And the story is entitled Among the Thorns. Hi, Veronica. Oh, you're muted.
I'm so sorry. Thank you.
Hello.
Hi, I am just delighted to be here. I'm delighted and honored to have a story in the book. Thank you so much. And it's an interesting story to me because, you know, I wrote my first academic book about revision, about revising fairy tales, and made the argument, you know, along with other arguments, but part of my argument was that revising fairy tales or myth is almost always an act of love. The idea is almost never to replace or efface the earlier version, because of course revising or reworking a story does just the opposite of that. It revives and revivifies the earlier versions and earlier tales because they need to be there in order to make meaning of the revision. And now I have this story, Among the Thorns, which is the only fairy tale inspired work I've ever done about a story that I really loathe. As opposed to a fairy tale that I really love. It's a response to the Brother Grimm's fairy tale, The Jew in the Thornbush, which is a story of a stout German peasant servant who gets 3 magic wishes and uses them to torture a Jewish man he meets by the side of the road. And then at the next town, he gets him hanged. And then the story ends with presumably everybody else living happily ever after. And it's pretty horrifying to my mind. And I feel pretty good about saying objectively horrifying. And it was pretty commonly translated in collections of the Grimms until, well, the Holocaust, when I guess it stopped being such an amusing story. And so as a fairy tale scholar, of course, I had read it and been upset by it. As a Jewish fairy tale scholar, I should say, although presumably as a human fairy tale scholar, I would have been upset by it anyway. And I wrote this response to it, which is essentially a revenge fantasy in which the Jewish man's daughter comes back to that town 10 years later and wreaks terrible revenge on the protagonist of the first fairy tale, as well as the town that aided and abetted him. And I still wonder if it's a story I should have written, or because of course, in writing that story, I'm giving new life to the Jew in the Thornbush. And perhaps I should have just let it die out quietly. At the same time, I was very angry at the Jew in the Thornbush. And I do think it's a good story, and I'm proud of the research I did on it, and I'm proud of the work I did on it, and I like the character I created. So it's a story that has a lot of ambivalence for me. And you know what, I'm not quite sure how I'm going to, where I'm going with this last point here. I think I'm just, it's a story that has a lot of ambivalence for me, especially given that I do write a lot of fairy tale inspired fiction, and I do it because I love fairy tales for the same reason I work on fairy tales as a scholar. I've always said that academia does not pay well enough to sell out, so you should work on what you really love. And if you're going to sell out, get big money for it. So I hope that the story is generative and interesting, and poses questions to the reader about what fairy tales are and how we use them, and how we make use of a legacy that is not always necessarily what we want it to be. And that's what I have to say about it.
Thank you so much, Veronica. I'm personally very, very glad that you wrote the story, and that we are able to, we're able to read it in different venues now, in 2 different books, and it was also published in Tor. So I think it's good to have it out there. And anger is very generative, as we know. As feminists know, at least. The second of 3 fiction writers and scholars participating in this event is Danielle Wood. Danielle is joining us from Tasmania, where she teaches writing at the University of Tasmania. And she will be talking about her piece in the collection, The Good Mother. Danielle.
Well, hello world. So I'm coming to you today from the country of the Muhanina people, country that was never ceded, and I pay my respects to the First Nations people of our island. So 2 quick remarks to start. One is just to say I'm absolutely thrilled to have my work included in this beautiful book, and alongside the varied and wonderful work of such talented contributors. So thank you, Christina and Jennifer, for making my work part of it. The other thing to say is I find the fairy tale studies community very special. It's actually quite rare in the academic world to find such genuine respect and collaboration and conversation between the creatives and the scholars. So as well as there's a recognition in that community that any one of us might be both of those things at the same time or at different times. So I really want to thank everyone involved in this book for strengthening even further that really lovely bond that we have. It's special. Now my work in Inviting Interruptions is called The Good Mother. It's a rather jaundiced monologue of sorts, and it's the prologue to this book of mine called Mother's Grimm. Now, Mother's Grimm is a suite of 4 long stories, and each one of them intersects with a fairy tale. So in this book, I haven't so much retold fairy tales as picked the eyes out of them to investigate how parts of very old stories can resonate in the contemporary world. So in one of my stories, I've been in conversation with the fairy tale Rapunzel, but there's no tower in my story. The character I'm really interested in is the relinquishing mother. And my question was, in today's world, who would give up a baby for a handful of leafy greens, and why? Because I hope you're all going to read The Good Mother in Inviting Interruptions, I'm actually going to read you the tiniest bit from another story in the collection, which is Cottage. And Cottage, of course, is my take on Hansel and Gretel, and it was inspired by things I saw at a childcare centre when my children were very little. And one of those things was there was a woman who would pick up her child from childcare every evening, and this child would kick and scream and say, "I hate you, mummy. I don't want you, mummy. I want Kirsten," who was his carer at the school, at the primary school, the childcare centre. And obviously I couldn't just stroll up to this woman and ask the story. And so when it often the case, when I find something curious happening, I decide to make up the story. Please rest assured that even if the tone of this story sounds critical, I'm questioning and exploring, not judging. I'm really grateful I had quality childcare that enabled me to keep working and writing. So I'm just going to read you a tiny bit of Cottage from Mother's Grimm. When Henry began childcare, he developed the habit in the mornings while his mother Nina was dressing of filling his pockets with such small items as he could find about the house. Then, when it was time to leave, Nina, already buttoned into her coat, would kneel down on the threshold to divest him of his treasures. There was a morning when she unpocketed a miniature Batmobile, 3 marbles, a biro, and four toy soldiers, along with some other less expected items, a safety pin, a thumb drive, and a plectrum. It wasn't only the pockets of his clothes that she had to search, the deep side pockets of his parka, all 5 pockets of his overalls, and the easy to forget knitted pockets on each end of his scarf, but also the zippered nooks of his bag too. In these he had squirreled a squash ball, a tea light candle, a spoon, a cotton reel, a padlock, and some small nail clippers. Also the thimble-sized bucket from his pirate ship set. Nina made a sad face. How would you feel if you lost this at school? It wasn't school, of course. He'd only just turned 2. The word was supposed to make him feel older and her less guilty. Please, Henry asked, reaching out again for the toy bucket. I bring it back, I promise. But you won't, but you don't, but you just can't be expected to, Nina whined to herself as she got to her feet. Henry looked mournfully at his robbed cash, now just a jumble of junk on the kitchen table. What were Henry's plans? Might things have turned out differently, Nina now wonders, had she not daily emptied out his pockets before walking him to the car and driving a disorienting pattern of lefts and rights to the other side of the city, to the place where she would leave him. If only she had left herself a trail in moonbright pebbles or white breadcrumbs, she might have been able to find her way back through the months and weeks to find out. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, Danielle. That's amazing. I think we are moving on now to our next novelist, short story writer, and essayist. Sofia Samatar is living in Virginia and teaching at James Madison University, and she contributed Selkie Stories Are for Losers. So, are you there, Sofia?
I am. Thank you. Thank you so much. And I, like others, want to thank Christina and Jennifer for including me in this beautiful book. It was much prettier than I expected, I have to say. I was really thrilled to receive my copy. And I'm going to read you a little taste of my story that is in the book, Selkie Stories Are for Losers. I hate Selkie stories. They're always about how you went up to the attic to look for a book and you found a disgusting old coat and brought it downstairs between finger and thumb and said, "What's this?" And you never saw your mom again. I work at a restaurant called La Pasha. I got the job after my mom left to help with the bills. On my first night at work, I got yelled at twice by the head server, burnt my fingers on a hot dish, spilled lentil parsley soup all over my apron, and left my keys in the kitchen. I didn't realize at first I'd forgotten my keys. I stood in the parking lot, breathing slowly and letting the oil smell lift away from my hair. And when all the other cars had started up and driven away, I put my hand in my jacket pocket. Then I knew. I ran back to the restaurant and banged on the door. Of course, no one came. I smelled cigarette smoke an instant before I heard the voice. Hey. I turned and Mona was standing there, smoke rising white from between her fingers. I left my keys inside, I said. After work, Mona says, "Got the keys?" We get in my car and I drive us through town to the Bone Zone, a giant cemetery on a hill. I pull into the empty parking lot and Mona rolls a joint. There's only one lamp, burning high and cold in the middle of the lot. Mona pushes her shoes off and puts her feet up on the dashboard and cries. She warned me about that the night we met. I said something stupid to her like, "You're so funny." And she said, "Actually, I cry a lot. That's something you should know." I was so happy she thought I should know things about her. I didn't care. I still don't care, but it's true that Mona cries a lot. She cries because she's scared her mom will take her away to Egypt, where the family used to live and where Mona has never been. What would I do there? I don't even speak Arabic. She wipes her mascara on her sleeve, and I tell her to look at the lamp outside and pretend that its glassy brightness is a bonfire and that she and I are personally throwing every Selkie story ever written onto it and watching them burn up. "You and your Selkie stories," she says. I tell her they're not my Selkie stories, not ever, and I'll never tell one, which is true, I never will. And I don't tell her how I went up to the attic that day, or that what I was looking for was a book I used to read when I was little, Beauty and the Beast, which is a really decent story about an animal who gets turned into a human and stays that way, the way it's supposed to be. I don't tell Mona that Beauty's black hair coiled to the edge of the page, or that the Beast had yellow horns and a smoking jacket, or that instead of finding the book, I found the coat, and my mom put it on and went out the kitchen door and started up her car. One Selkie story tells about a man from Mirdalore. He was on the cliffs one day and heard people singing and dancing inside a cave, and he noticed a bunch of skins piled on the rocks. He took one of the skins home and locked it in a chest, and when he went back, a girl was sitting there alone, crying. She was naked, and he gave her some clothes and took her home. They got married and had kids. You know how this goes. One day, the man changed his clothes and forgot to take the key to the chest out of his pocket. And when his wife washed the clothes, she found it. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you, Sophia. Burning girls and burning stories with all the ambiguities there. The creative work of our final presenter includes digital print, interactive narrative, and experimental video. Joellyn Rock teaches at the University of Minnesota Duluth, and we've included bare bones in our collection. And Joellyn is going to share her screen as well. Thank you.
Hope this works. Okay, sorry, I'm going to start by sharing my screen. Can you hear me? Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
We can hear you.
Sorry. I'm going to talk a little bit and then I'm going to play something. And I wanted to just start out by scrubbing through this a little bit to talk about the beginning for me of working with this fairy tale. The story of Vasalisa and Baba Yaga was not known to me growing up, though I love fairy tales and old tales and I've been working with them for years. I didn't know this one. And so it really caught me and I wanted to work with it. I love the crazy, surreal composite of Baba Yaga and her world and the power of that witch. And I love that it also echoed the Cinderella tales in a way. And it's a Russian fairy tale that I wanted to bring into digital media. So I wanted to remediate an old story for new media. And in the process, I did a lot of image making. I was getting an MFA in graphic design 20 years ago, and I did so many little images and research and searching for patterns and telling the story through a series of images. Grieve, leave, navigate, encounter, serve, separate. So Vasalisa is sent on the impossible task of getting fire from Baba Yaga, the witch that lives in the woods. And of course she gets put to work and has to sort and separate poppy seeds and dirt, all sorts of tasks that are impossible. And for me, that was a great metaphor for what I was going through with graduate school as a graphic designer. The kind of fussy all-night work that graphic designers do felt very parallel to the tasks of Vasalisa and Baba Yaga. So over the course of working on that, you know, she does get the fire from Baba Yaga, by the way. And, but my goal was to also incorporate this sense of multiplicity and the multivalence of fairy tales into my research. So there is not just one Vasalisa, but there's many, many. And that's part of, for me, the pleasure of working with fairy tales is that we can stick onto them what we want to. And we can make them our own, but we also, at least I do, remediate them into other media forms. And in fact, it's sort of interesting being invited into inviting interruptions is almost a remediation back into book for me from digital media. So I thought I would share a little mashup today of work that is both print work, it's book work, it's interactive narrative work for digital media. And I wanted to introduce you to the fact that I am somebody who does a lot of remixing. I mash things up and I reapply them. So, oops, I'm gonna push this for a second. This is the website at rockingchair.org. It was created 20 years ago. And it is a web experience of that era meant that images had to be very small, very low res. You could scroll through things, you could click on hypertext, but you could not post videos, you could not do multimedia, on a big scale on the web. So this is kind of like already, it's an artifact. It's like it's a folk website. And I thought I would just show you what it looks like. And you click through the images across the top of the screen, lead to segments of the story. And then you can click on the word and then it brings you to a scrollable piece of text. And if you're really interested in fairy tales, which I think this group actually is, you go down the numbers down the left side, and you can also read my academic thesis and weave those together. So for each part of the story, there's a piece of academic writing too. But I wanted to share right now the fourth section of Bare Bones. It's called Encounter. It's where Vasalisa first meets Baba Yaga. I hope the sound is loud enough. Even though there was fresh snow on the ground, there were still Halloween decorations up around the joint. Paper skeletons swung from each porch post. Along the fence, plastic lights, little skulls, rattled and chattered, clickety-clack against the railing. The hut had long, jagged icicles, crystal bones, Yaga teeth hanging from its rafters. It grinned ferociously at anyone who dared approach. Weirdest of all, the dwelling suddenly stood up and whirled like a dervish on chicken's feet. It gave her the heebie-jeebies. No basement? A mobile home? Perhaps. Vasalisa heard a whir and looked up into the night sky. There, flying. There she saw it, the silhouette of Baba Yaga descending in her mortar with the pestle, in her black
cauldron, her creepy Cuisinart coming in for a landing. With greasy hair streaming behind her, hag like a giant eraser for deleting her own tracks. She screeched into her parking place and dismounted with a slam. She was in no mood for distractions. Baba Yaga just stood there with her hands on her hips in the strange glow of the skulls, and Vasalisa took in this shocking composite, this awful specter of a woman, part grandmother, part beast. Baba Yaga was a bony thing. Her look, like the witch in your own worst horror movie. That nose, you know, that chin you're imagining, those teeth like pinking shears, and that wart that belongs in a museum. Her breasts sagged like water balloons, to her knees, no doubt. And those legs, one all bone with spidery veins, and the other lumpy and brown, made out of excrement. Excrement? That's what it says. Baba Yaga stopped and sniffed at the air. She clapped her hands, muttered some code, some password under her breath, and the hut rotated upon command, opening its entrance automatically like a garage door. What do you want? Okay.
Wow.
Could you hear that?
Yes, it was great. Thank you.
That was amazing. We may have gone a little over, and it's because these works are amazing. These people are great. What artists, wow. So can we continue a little longer? Marie, Emily,
Yeah.
yes. I just wanted to say something, and I hope there are questions for contributors especially, but I just want to thank everyone for being here. It's so great to see so many people and so many friends, and yeah, makes me feel like we did the right thing to put this book together. So
Yes,
thank you.
I totally agree. So amazing to see so many friends, old and new, and contributors to the book. And yeah, this is so much more exciting than I expected it to be. So thank you all.
Yes, we can go just a few minutes over, absolutely, if people have questions. So happy to hear any questions that anyone might have. I really can't imagine a better introduction to this book. I hope you were all as intrigued and just moved. I feel like I'm sitting here with a lot of emotion right now from the strength of the literature, the art. It was just wonderful. So thank you all so much. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat at the moment. And am I missing any raised hands? Let me do a scan. But I have a question, kind of almost a game, but I was thinking about Christina and Jennifer. Earlier you were talking about your hope and the goal of intertextuality for this anthology, which I think is so really evident as you pick up the book and as how the pieces talk to each other. But I had a question about what two pieces or maybe more work together in a really specific way for you, where you're like, these were made to be in a book together, even if they weren't.
Oh, wow.
Do you want to take that? Jennifer?
Thank you, Christina.
No, trust the acquisition editor to ask us a question we're not ready for. Okay.
I didn't mean to throw a stumper. It's just something that's been on my mind. And I'm curious if contributors have a response to that as well.
Yeah, I think Christina and I picked texts that we loved and images that we loved, and a lot of the time it was kind of serendipitous that so many of them speak so well to each other on multiple different levels. So a story will talk to an image through sort of maybe echoes of, eco-criticism, for example. I'm sort of thinking about a couple of stories that talk back and forth with images that way. Or those same ones might talk to other texts as well about, we have a lot of good mothers and not so good mothers, as it turns out, that come through, as we saw even today with some of the talks. So there are a lot of different connections, I think, and that's part of the intertextuality, but also really the important part of the intersectionality that we really wanted to bring to the book on multiple levels. But I would love to hear if any of the contributors have anything to say about themselves, or I don't know. Don't want to put
Well,
it on the spot.
I have something that occurred to me when I think of two stories and being excited that these two things are in the same book. My friend, fellow writer Dirye Osman, the author of Fairy Tales for Lost Children, has a piece in the book, and we were really excited. We didn't realize for a while that we were both in the same anthology, but I'm Somali American and he's British Somali, and there aren't like a huge super ton of Somali diaspora people writing in English who are writing fantasy. Like, it's a pretty small, it's not a lot of us. And so, and we've never been in a book together before. So that's kind of a random example maybe, but it's just, it definitely came into my head when I heard that question, that we were very excited to find ourselves in the same anthology for the first time.
That's really cool. I don't think, well, I didn't know you knew each other. Christina, did you know they knew each other?
I did not know that you did, but I'm really glad that this is another connection for you too. And I mean, I love that story, Fairy Tales for Lost Children, and the whole book and his work and their work. I just wanted to say something about maybe Little Red Riding Hood, David Kaplan's film, and the Nalo Hopkinson's mixed media artwork. Still rather fond of red, because in some ways, you know, we talk about fairy tales being for everyone and speaking in different ways also to individuals and people in different groups and places. And so I think Nalo Hopkinson's image and her stories as well, which are not in the book, really bring a different kind of interrogation to the narrative of Red Riding Hood as we know it. And then the other connection that I am particularly happy about is that of having Brian Kamali Kuwata's story of No Real Account. And it's a story set in Hawaii based on or retelling Hawaiian mo'olelo, and Dan Taulapapa McMullen's image of Aitu. And I think those two texts bring to life the idea that wonder tales, you know, in other cultures, especially indigenous cultures, maybe have a different kind of valence, are not so fictional as we think of fairy tales and all of that. So yeah, for me, that connection is very important between those two texts.
If I could respond briefly, and also I don't know if Sophia would feel any kind of connection to this, but coming from colonized spaces, as artists and writers, we're often sort of given a task to present a certain kind of reality that almost verges on a sort of socialist realism of what our experience is, and to enter into fantasy. And the fairy tale is, it doesn't necessarily enter into the anti-colonial project to go into that realm. But I don't know, maybe that doesn't speak to you, Sophia, but that was something that I was thinking of. And but I did have a specific question also for Sue. In your beautiful little worlds that you create there, because I have this issue with text in artwork, is the words can overpower the artwork. But I didn't know if the text, is it almost sort of arbitrary to the story of the artwork? Are they pages from the stories? It doesn't matter what you read on the figure.
Yes, no, it links in. So the pages are open at that kind of relates to the visual artwork. Although it's kind of, you kind of have to look for those connections. You have to look closely.
Sometimes I feel like it's better almost to say something where the viewer is puzzled by how it connects to the, but it can still have a connection, but I don't know if that's.
Yeah. They kind of just add another layer of meaning, I guess.
Yeah.
Ray, I had a little something to add about your question about how things work together. One of the really interesting things about this collection and about the kind of fairy tale studies community more generally is that many of us are coming to this with a really solid past of shared reading. You know, we've read the fairy tales themselves, and then, you know, as Christina mentioned, you know, most of us will have read Angela Carter and Jack Zipes, and so most of us will have seen Disney films. So although we're all doing incredibly different things, there's kind of like a shared genealogy of reading that we have, which is, I think, I'd be interested to see if other people agree with me. It seems to me to be unusually homogenous in a field. Like we've read and seen and are responding to a similar set of things, but we're proving all the time that responses can be infinite.
That's really interesting.
An amazing.
Danielle.
I'll just say want to say one thing and then I'll shut up. But because I just read the most amazing book called The Notebook. Have you read this book? By and it starts off as a fairy tale of these two brothers and their grandmother who never washes herself. But it's actually a metaphor about fleeing World War II. And it's an amazing book, The Notebook. And it's a fairy tale because it's about these two little boys, and they're horrible little boys, and they terrorize the world. And they live with this grandmother who never washes herself in this little cottage on the edge of a country that is slowly destroying itself, and that destroys them. And it's also a great metaphor for how fairy tales express the destruction of worlds, which is something I think colonial people can relate to. But we don't, I think, utilize the fairy tale as much as we could.
I'm thinking about the two comments that were made today. You know, Sue mentioned fairy tales being one-dimensional, and David used the word spare in terms of character and location. And it reminds me of Kate Bernheimer writing about the flat characters, right? The flat characters of fairy tales. This is, not something this is something you'll be criticized for in contemporary literature if your characters are flat, but it is exactly what makes the fairy tales so possible to do so many different things with them, because they are flat and spare and one-dimensional and all of those things that, contemporary literature reviewers would say they don't like. But that's exactly, sort of the power and the openness of the genre, I think.
Thank you all. Marina has a question. Would you like to say it out loud, Marina?
Yeah, I need to unmute myself. So I have a question to Christina. I mean, I have the question to the editors and as well as this particular Russian fairy tale. And I apologize for this particular question, but I am the one who grew up with this particular fairy tale. You know, I am from Russia and I am a Slavist. I mean, I am a scholar of Russian fairy tales, actually the Soviet period. Why did you choose this particular one with Baba Yaga? Because it's an amazing character. If you want, this is the first feminist, you know, in Russian folklore, because she lives by herself. She lives between day and night. She lives at the end of the forest. She is not married. I mean, she is her own person, her own, well, woman, if you want, because actually she was always played by male actors in Russian films and in Russian fairy tales. Why this particular fairy tale? I find it absolutely amazing the way it is done, but why this one and not anything more traditional, if you want?
So is this a question for me or?
I think it is.
To all three of you, so yeah.
I mean, I chose it partly because I did not grow up with it. And so it had special power for me and I recognized in Baba Yaga a really incredibly powerful witch, you know, and so all the forces were at work. And then it also was the dynamic between the young girl who has to work for the older woman. And that, which we see in many fairy tales, but there was something parallel to being in graduate school at that moment. And so there's many reasons why I chose to work with that story. But again, I didn't know it. I had come across it and then I had to start reading many versions. I just made my own version. Composites.
And this is amazing because your illustration, I mean, if I look at those trees, you know, how you because Baba Yaga is part of nature, so and she fits into this nature, and the way you picture her and the way you create the background, I mean, it fits. It's absolutely amazing. I mean, I'm just sitting there and my jaw dropped when I saw the first illustration. So thank you so much. But it's interesting that the choice was made not only by you, but also by the editors to choose this particular work, you know, that illustrates a totally controversial character, if you want, you know, in the folklore stories. So
very briefly, because I know we're really out of time.
Sorry.
I mean, I think our first choice is really the artists and the writers that we wanted to feature, not so much a particular story. And not all of the stories that are included in the collection or are referred to in the collection are fairy tales, right? They may be legends, they may be mo'olelo, there are different kinds of wondrous stories. But I think, yes, we are for featuring a controversial character. And I think the work of, you know, Kay Turner and Pauline Greenhill have really made Baba Yaga and other witches and crones, you know, well, I'll just say models for us in some ways. And also I know that Danielle, who had to leave, is trying to work on fiction that kind of relocates and transplants Baba Yaga into Tasmania and is trying to work through what does that mean and how do you do that and why do you even want to do it. So anyway, those were kind of the connections for me with the criticism, with the work on witches and crones and fairy tales, and with really Joellyn's work.
Thank you.
And I think just really quick, another reason that I was really drawn to it on my side as well is the dynamism of the story and the interactions of the modern and the ancient, with the moving from suburbia into the forest, with these temporal connections and tensions that go on, along with all of the other kinds of tensions that play out throughout Bare Bones, I think are fascinating, including the textual and the visual, because it's a textual visual text, I guess, right? So having all of that working together in that was a real draw for us as well, I think.
Thank you all so much. That was absolutely wonderful. Just thrilled to hear your thoughts about and see your beautiful presentations. I want to make one more plug for the book page on the Wayne State University Press website. You can visit that for more information about how to get your own copy. And also check out the chat. Kate had a wonderful comment in there that's really worth thinking about. And actually, I'll read it out if that's okay. That shared genealogy of reading that Danielle mentioned is sort of a double-edged sword. It's a useful starting place that gives us a precious common language, but it could also skew into the territory of so many Western canons. That's why I'm so glad that work like this book exists, which showcases non-white Indigenous perspectives and also shows how so many tale tropes aren't owned by Western traditional tales. They're echoed everywhere and can be universal. Take a read. Thank you so much. That's a great point to remember. And yeah, Emily, is there any final words we should say here?
Thank you all for coming. This was a lovely conversation. Congratulations again to Christina and Jennifer on a lovely collection.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for spending some time with us.
Yes.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for coming.